Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us in this presentation of Signs and Symptoms, or Is I Is or Is I Ain't. At the end of this presentation, I'd like for you to take advantage of the online assessment tool that we've provided, which will give you an opportunity to take a look and see where you might be in all of this, or if you or someone you love may have a problem. Again, thanks again, and we'll move on to the next segment. We've been doing a number of sessions on Is I Is or Is I Ain't. The first segment we did was kind of the overview of what addiction is, what it's not. Even in a treatment group, in a relapse prevention group, we can do signs and symptoms, because very often I'll use it as a great relapse prevention tool, because I can look at it and all the things that are on the list that we use. Every one of those things occurred in my drinking, everything on there except for two things. And I always tell people the two things that are on there that didn't happen is I never got arrested, and that wasn't from lack of trying. It just didn't happen. And the other thing is I'm not dead yet. And I've certainly over the years remained smart enough, I think, to know that if all those other things on there that I swore never was going to happen, if they happened, there's a pretty good chance those other things are right there if I pick up again. So it's a great relapse prevention tool as well. So again, we've looked at kind of an overview of the stages of addiction. The second segment, we looked at part two of that kind of middle or early stage stuff. Then we looked at middle stage, and now we're going to take a look at the final piece. Andrew, how are you doing tonight? It's good to see you. Where we're going to start with this. Again, I'm just going to assume that you were here for all the other segments and kind of know the initial piece. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll start. This will probably go about 45 minutes, which is what the other segments have gone. So we'll see if we can do that. So anyway, with the late stage stuff, I had mentioned in the very final comments with middle stage that one of the things that we start to see at this point is the drinking, the use, the gambling, whatever we're looking at, really starts to take precedence. It's taken more and more of a person's time and attention away. And in late stage, you see this probably better than any other of the stages of addiction. I'd mentioned in the very beginning session that to give you an idea of what we're up against, the word addiction comes from a Latin word, addictus, that means all-consuming. And it also, kind of a loose translation of that, is to devote one's entire being to. So it doesn't take much to see that the active use starts to take center stage and everything else gets a back seat. Well, I want to start off this late stage segment. We had talked about middle stage. Also, sometimes people refer to it as a rationalization phase. And if you're not familiar with that, rationalization basically is an unreasonable reason for doing whatever it is we're doing. Now, the person says, well, yes, I'm doing it, but here's why. And that became kind of my mantra for years before I got sober. I had a perfectly legitimate reason why my life was falling apart. And you'll see some examples of that here in a few minutes, too. So what we're going to look at is initially going to compare two people or two types of folks. We're going to look at a social drinker and the alcoholic. And where this little illustration plays into this, the third stage, the late stage of addiction, very often has been titled, or the philosophy behind it is basically that now all of a sudden all responsibilities interfere with the drinking or the drug use, the gambling, again, whatever the problem is. And I'd like to give you a little visual illustration of how that happens. Again, if you take these two people, one's a social drinker, maybe even a non-drinker, okay, and the other person's an alcoholic, what you see is a dynamic that looks very, very similar to this. In the center of the social drinker or non-drinker's life is responsibilities. Everything revolves around that. Work, school, family, church, cutting the grass, paying the bills. Responsibility, just getting the job done, everything revolves around that. If the drug use, the drinking, again, whatever it may be, and for our purposes tonight, I'm just going to start referring to talking about the drinking, okay? Certainly, again, covers a lot of territory, again, other drugs of choice and that type of thing. So anyway, if we're talking about the drug use, or again, the drinking, that's on the fringe. It's there, but it's not an integral, important part of the person's life. It's kind of the reward at the end of the day. Okay, so for the social drinker, non-drinker, his or her good day is, I got my job done, whatever that might be, and at the end of the day, there was that reward, and if that didn't occur, no big deal. It's not the end of the world. Maybe tomorrow. It's not an important part. So it's on the fringe. In addiction, we see a complete reversal of that. Okay? The central focus becomes the drinking. Everything revolves around it. Again, the word addiction, to devote one's entire being to. We start to see the focus is here. Responsibilities are on the fringe. So back in the day, a good day for me was if I got out of pain, got out of withdrawals, got out of all the things that were being created by the day previous drinking, that was my primary focus. And if I remembered to go to work, that was a bonus. If you remembered to do something else, that was a bonus. If not, still had a productive day. So that's the switch that we see. The social, recreational, casual person, everything revolves around getting the job done. The drinking's on the edge. It's the reward. In active addiction, like I said, it's a reversal of this. Everything revolves around the use. And almost responsibilities, taking care of that becomes the reward. We remembered to do that. Okay? There's an old saying in French, and I always tell people this is certainly no indication of my fluency in French, but I do remember this one phrase from high school and college French. Raison d'être means the reason to be. And I've always equated the reason to be with the addiction, because the average, again, social, recreational, casual, non-user, responsibility, family, school, church, community, whatever, that's their reason to be. For the person in active addiction, the reason to be is the use. So everything revolves around it. So again, you can see why they call this stage, this late stage, why they look at that is responsibilities start to interfere with the drinking. That's the most integral, important part of the person's life at that point. Okay. With that, we're going to take a look at some late stage things, and you'll have to. Didn't figure out till a little while ago how to actually flip the board over. So, and if I had, everything would have been upside down. So, all this and brains too, I tell you. I feel like a magician's assistant. You know, just can we spin her around one more time? I told somebody not too long ago, was doing a presentation, and they asked if I needed a PowerPoint and all the computer stuff, and I told them, I said, nah, just a dry erase board. And they goes, oh my God, that's just so old-fashioned. And I said, it took me 10 years to get used to doing this. I used to use a blackboard, so this is high tech for me. So anyway, when we take a look at late stage, this is, and like I had mentioned, and you'll see this several times in here, all the symptoms that we see, we talk about addiction being a progressive illness. And what I mean by that is it gets worse over time. So what we see happen is when somebody crosses from one stage to the next, we don't leave early stage symptoms behind. pick up the new stuff, and then move into the next stage, pick up the new stuff and leave all that. What happens is we pick up the new symptoms and drag all the old junk in with it. So not only in late stage are we carrying early stage symptoms, they're more intense and more frequent. We're also carrying middle stage symptoms in. They're more intense and more frequent. And then late stage, we've got all the new stuff to go with it. One of the things that you'll see, if you don't realize already, in early recovery, we talk about one of the first normal early symptoms of early sobriety is exhaustion. And there's no reason, or certainly the reason I think is very apparent for most of us. The reason why exhaustion is the number one symptom. When we first come into recovery, we've been hauling a lot of junk around with us. Very often I'll refer to active addiction as a full-time job with no vacation. Very often people will say, well, I didn't drink every day, didn't use every day. Doesn't matter. If you're in active addiction, you're always in the state of three. We're either using, getting over using, or getting ready for the next use. There's not a lot of wiggle room. Again, you can see where it starts to completely take over. You don't have to have it in your hand to have it have an impact. So we're either using, getting over using, or getting ready for the next use. So like I said, a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the earlier segments, you'll see show up here again, but in a more drastic and intensified way. Very first one that we're going to take a look at is there's a drastic increase in relief drinking. If you weren't here for the previous segments, we were talking about relief drinking is basically one of my definitions of addiction is when the cure for the problem becomes the cause. When what we're using to fix a problem becomes the thing that starts to create the problem. The problem with that is for a while it works. Alcohol is the greatest relaxation, stress management tool we have, except for about 10% of us when it starts to create the very problem we're trying to deal with. So the cure for the problem becomes the cause. Well, over time, you see this drastic increase in relief drinking. It's not an occasional thing. It's every time. It doesn't have to be every day, but it becomes every time the person is drinking, there's a couple of days of relief drinking that follows it. Okay? I'm going to spend a minute talking about something that you might be familiar with. There's a few of these that I want to spend a little bit of time with, so a few I'm just going to kind of gloss over. But some of you might be familiar with something called a geographical cure. And if you remember back to the first segment, I had mentioned that one of the greatest myths about addiction, people have this backward look at what addiction is. We talk about the 5 W's and an H. Addiction has nothing to do with what the person's doing, when they do it, where they're from, where they're doing it, who they are, why they do it. It has everything to do with how it affects them when they do it. Well, very often the why, you hear this all the time. If you had my wife, you'd drink too. You had my husband. You had my kids. You had my job, my neighborhood. Geographical cure, if I had $1 for every time I talk to somebody doing an intake before they come into treatment, every time I heard them say, you know, I just need a fresh start. If I could just get out of here, not here, but if I could just get out of here, things would be different. Well, one of the things that most of us find out, unfortunately, is when somebody does a geographical cure, you find out that wherever it is you move, the drinking took the flight before you, and it's there waiting for you. Okay? I had a woman years ago, this talk about alcoholic thinking. The only reason I have a drinking problem is I got a crappy job, my parents don't understand me, I live in a hole, I'm too smart for, on and on and on and on. If I could get out of this area, I'd be fine. The drinking wouldn't, it's everywhere. Some people, I'm not telling tales out of school, if some of you are familiar, if you live in the Annapolis area. It's an old saying about Annapolis is a drinking town with a sailing problem. Well, very often, we certainly, she kind of had that idea. If I could just get away from here. So she moved to a place where there's absolutely no booze at all. She moved to Paris. There's that geography. If I could just get out of here, things would be, well, of course. It not only took the flight before, it was on the flight with her. So that geographical cure, if I could just change this, things would be okay. I never did a geographical cure, but I did a variation of that. I did a job cure. Alcoholics and addicts of whatever kind, we develop a sixth sense. It's almost like, the heat's on and we know it, and we bail out. I can't tell you how many jobs I quit right before I'd get fired because I knew that today's going to be the day I got to bail out. So instead of looking at maybe I have a problem, what's the common denominator in all these really cruddy jobs I seem to be having, instead of looking at that, the easiest way to deal with that is just bail out, go find another job, which I always back then certainly could. Today might be a little different, but certainly back then it wasn't a problem at all. So I did a job cure. We were talking this afternoon in one of the earlier segments about, again, rationalization and denial. Those are defense mechanisms, and defense mechanisms are basically normal, everyday coping skills, problem solvers. We use them all the time to deal with just day-to-day stuff. Problem is, in active addiction, we take those normal problem solvers and turn them into justifications. And we've got a number of those that we've talked about in other sessions. Denial is the big one. Okay? It's not a problem because there's no problem. And then there's rationalization. Well, it's a problem, but here's why. And then there's minimizing. Well, it's a problem, but I'm not as bad as him. What we call identifying out, that kind of thing. Then we have one that I took to an art form that I think is kind of along the lines of the geographical or job cure. It's called projection. And this is where the person buys some time. I didn't deny the fact that I had a drinking problem anymore. In fact, I embraced it. And anytime somebody would say, especially my wife would say, you've got a problem, instead of saying, no, I don't, I got very, very good at saying, you're right. I do have a problem, and it's your fault. And by saying that, I wasn't denying the fact I had a problem. I was denying ownership of it. It's there, but it's all yours. The beauty, or the sad part, the sickness part of that, is that gives me an out. Because I would continue to drink. You haven't changed. And you haven't changed because you ain't the problem. So the more she would say, it's getting worse, and it'd say, well, you haven't fixed anything. You're still here. Okay? That's projection. You bet it's a problem, but it's not my fault. You change, and then I will. This is a huge, huge relapse trigger that we'll talk about in another session because this can be very devastating in active recovery. So we have that. We have one I'm going to mention because we're going to do a little overview of this in a minute. This point in the drinking, we start to see some really impaired thinking. AA has a great way of looking at it. We talk about stinking thinking. All of a sudden, it makes sense to us, the things that we're doing, the things that we're saying, but to the average person, the family member, the friends, the coworkers, they don't have a clue what it is we're talking about or why we're doing the things we're doing, and we think we're perfectly okay. So there's this impaired thinking. The next one, and I had mentioned this in the early stage segment, that this is one of the rare things that you see. If nothing else shows up on a list of signs and symptoms except this is a dead giveaway that addiction is there. One of the symptoms or early symptoms that we see is there's an increase in tolerance. And I had mentioned that that's not a function of alcoholism or cocaine addiction or any substance addiction. What that's all about, that's a function of chemistry, function of biology. It takes more to do the same thing over time. You can ask the social recreational drinker, does it take a few more to do the same thing that used to, the result that you were looking for that you used to get years ago? Does it take a little bit more? And most people say, well, yeah, a little. Well, that's an increase in tolerance. It takes more over time. We had mentioned also that the social recreational drinker his or her tolerance will increase to a point and then usually kind of plateaus out and stays within some framework of, and I'd mentioned we have nice ways of talking about it. When people say, well, 2 or 3 is my limit, or 1 or 2 is my limit. Well, most people, social drink, will stay within those boundaries, and occasionally there might be that blowout where there's, an anniversary and the person has 6 or 7 or 8, and they wake up the next day and go, oh my God, I'll never do that again. And they don't. When they go back to the next drinking episode, it's within those couple. The alcoholic's tolerance increases over time as well. Except our tolerance increases, plateaus, increases, plateaus. It's always getting higher and higher. Again, not to sound silly about it, but I had mentioned very non-clinical diagnostic tool. If you know somebody, have a friend who, every time you see them, they say, well, 2 or 3 is my limit. And then the next time you see them, well, 5 or 6 is my limit. And then, well, 15 or 20, that's my limit. They're plateauing. They have a limit, but it's always getting more and more and more. In late stage addiction, you see a drastic change. And it only happens in late stage addiction. Social drinkers who, if they ever say, well, I experienced this, they're not social drinkers. There's a decrease in tolerance. And the reason there's a decrease in tolerance, what was happening was over time it was taking more and more to do the same thing. Then after a while I started to realize it was taking less and less to do the same thing, because what I was looking for, if you remember, to back up just a second, I had mentioned in one of the other segments, another way of looking at the stages of addiction. Early stage is fun. Middle stage is fun with consequences. Late stage is consequences. It's all problems. Okay? Well, here we're starting to see that. Towards the end of the drinking, I wasn't drinking or using to be the life of the party, to get a buzz on, to do whatever it was I was looking to do. What I was doing was basically looking to maintain. So now all of a sudden, where it used to take 15, 20, 30 to pass out, now it's taking 10. And then it was taking 5. And then it was taking a couple. And I would start to compare, because I'd look at people around me and say, well, Fred's drinking 2 or 3 and getting what he's looking for. I'm finally drinking 2 or 3 and I'm passing out. That's what I was looking for. After all these years, I've finally figured out how to drink. I'm finally learning how to do this, okay? And I remember when I was in treatment, and I usually tell people that's, if you think you're learning how to drink and you end up in treatment, kind of what's wrong with that picture. One night, my counselor we were doing medical aspects, kind of your brain on drugs, and she asked the question, anybody in here realized before they came in, they're drinking less than they were before? And yeah, sure am, because it was almost like a badge of honor. Yeah, I've figured this thing out. It's only taking me a couple and saving money. It's economics, She said, well, how do you feel? I said, because I'm finally learning how to drink. And she goes, is that right? I said, yes. Honestly, I'm getting more bang for my buck. Now, I'm just talking crap, basically, because in the back, I knew it was a problem. I knew it was a problem for a long time. I just didn't want it to be one. So I'm just talking, trying to make it sound like, oh yeah, this is no big. I'm here, and I'll get this thing under control. Well, she surprised me when she said, well, you know what? Technically, you are getting more bang for your buck. And I'm kind of puffed up a little bit, like, yeah, see, I'm smart. She said, yep. She said, technically, you're not learning how to drink. You're learning how to die. Your liver's it's starting to shut down. It's not handling at a rate that it normally would handle. I've mentioned in sessions before, alcohol detoxes at the rate of 1 ounce per hour. That's a constant. You can't speed it up. You can't slow it down. There's only one condition when that's not a factor, and that's when there's liver involvement, and basically the liver's struggling to do the best it can. So there's a decrease in tolerance. It's taken less and less, because technically the person is getting more bang for their buck.
Thing you were talking about last week?
Yeah,
like
yep.
One thing you didn't tell
And that's the one thing. And that's the one time that it happens. So here we have, there's a decrease in the amount. The next one, real quick, and like I said, I'm just going to gloss over a couple of these and then focus on the last couple here, because I think they're extremely critical. There's a situation or condition, goes by a lot of names, impending fears, overwhelming fears. Sometimes you hear people refer to it in meetings as impending doom. If you're not familiar with what that concept is all about, impending doom is kind of like the person is saying, well, I'm not real sure what's going to happen, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be good. Okay? So it's kind of like this cloud that just hangs over the person's head. There's this sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's about to hit the fan. Okay? This is where you really start to see the relief drinking really kick into high gear, because you got all this impending doom and, oh my God, it's, Chicken Little, the sky's falling. And how we deal with that is we drink or use more. I had mentioned in the last segment, you want a good comparison between another difference between the social drinker and the alcoholic. The social drinker says, if I get this and I get this, if I don't want this to happen anymore, I'm not doing this. There's a cause and effect. The alcoholic says, every time I drink, I get this. Or any of the stuff we talked about earlier. If I don't want this to happen, I need to drink more. So now we get stuck in that loop of the more I drank, the worse things got. The worse they got, the more I drank, the more I drank. So it's all of a sudden, this impending doom is being created by the very thing we're using to fix the problem. So again, it's driving us deeper and deeper into the hole. So that's an important one. A lot of us experience that. The next one, I'm going to do a little example, a little illustration with this as well. We're getting towards the end of the process here. And the next one that's mentioned is the person is unable to initiate action. Okay? Nothing happens. Very often you'll hear another term for this, especially if we're talking about marijuana use. We have a thing called amotivational syndrome, and that's just a fancy word for the person might have a whole lot of desire to do something, but no motivation to do it. Kind of that, a lot of ideas, but no energy. So it's kind of this, the person has all these ideas, and you start to see grandiose behavior and kind of shifting the focus away from the person. I used to love it, and this is how sick some of us get too. I would love it when somebody else at work would get into trouble, because that meant they were watching you, and they weren't watching me anymore. Okay? So all of a sudden, we start to see this whole shift where, again, we become super employee, super mom, super dad, super student. And very often we see that flash. It's almost like if you ever, and I know you got better things to do than this, but if you ever watch a light bulb right before it burns out, okay, it gets really bright and then it's gone. Okay? There's a surge of energy, a surge of activity that the unit can't handle, the filament can't handle, and it's like a sensory overload and it burns out. So very often, right before we flame out, at the very end here, there's that burst of activity, basically saying, don't look at me, I'm doing fine. I kind of compare it to one of my favorite movies. And everybody in here I know has seen this movie probably a million times. My favorite scene in The Wizard of Oz is when they're in the palace and they're scared and the wizard's yelling and screaming and the fire's, flaming all around. Toto's smarter than the rest of them. Toto runs over and pulls the curtain aside, and there's the wizard, and he looks up and goes, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. That's exactly what starts to happen here. This grandiose behavior. Pay no attention to me. I'm not a problem. I'm fine. I'm super employee, that kind of thing. That very often for a lot of us is that last burst before everything collapses, which you'll see here in a minute. The reason why I wanted to spend a little bit of time with the inability or unable to initiate action, make decisions, poor decision making, if any at all. if you've been with me before or a while, you knew we weren't going to be able to do something without the little brain guy showing up here. And if you're not familiar with this, I use this in medical aspects. I use this in a couple of other topics that we talk about. I've created a monster. I have a grandson who's 6.5. The very first thing he learned how to draw when he was about 2 was this. That little brain guys all over the place on pieces of paper. He'd come in and draw them on the board. Okay? So this little guy's got some history. So anyway, how he plays into this, if you take the brain, and again, you certainly know my artwork, use your imagination. If you take the brain and you cut it in half, it doesn't look a whole lot like this. Okay? But again, as an example, if you take the brain and cut it in half, one of the things that's been compared to over the years is an onion. You cut an onion in half, the outer layer of the onion is the largest part, and the closer you get to the center, the smaller and more compact the layers become. Well, the brain's kind of set up like that in a very, again, this is kind of not a literal look at the brain, but just as an example. Well, the outer part of the brain is the largest part, and we call that part, it's the cortex. And the cortex is responsible for a lot of things that are very, very important to day-to-day problem solving, day-to-day living, also day-to-day understanding whether we have is I is or is I ain't. Okay? One of the things that's housed in the cortex is reason. And reason is the ability to know right from wrong, good from bad, true from false, that type of thing. Okay, also housed in there. It's what we call judgment. And judgment is the ability to make a decision based on reason. And I've mentioned, 1,000 times, you put these two things together, it's what we call rational thought. So if somebody asks you to make a rational decision about something in your life, you're using reason and judgment. And if you're using reason and judgment, you're using the cortex. Okay? There's also housed in there a lot of other things, and I'll just put them up here for illustration, and we'll look at that in another session. Trust me. It's that doctor. I went to school to learn how to do that. Yeah. And there's times I can't read sense of self. It's smear of self. I'm left-handed. What can I say? So anyway, if you look at other things that are housed in the cortex, there's control, and some other parts of the brain are involved in this too, but the cortex is involved as well. Control over basic motor skills, coordination, reaction time, that type of thing. Control over what they call base emotions, anger, resentment, all the usual cast of characters that a lot of us have to deal with in recovery. Short-term memory, the ability to remember something that just occurred. I always tell people there's two types of information. There's nice to know and need to know. And not to show any power that I have over anybody, but everything I'm yakking about right now, whether you want it to or not, is going into your short-term memory. You can't help it. It's going in there. If it's important to you, it'll filter into long-term memory over time. If it's not important, by the time you get to your car, it's gone. Okay? So short-term memory is kind of the clearinghouse for everything we hear and learn and see. Also housed in there, and this is an important one for folks in recovery, is sense of self. Can you stand what you're looking at? Positive self things like self-respect, self-worth, self-esteem, self-confidence, all those things. Okay? All that's controlled and housed in the cortex. The first part of the brain that gets knocked offline is the cortex. And we're not talking about late-stage addiction. We're talking about just use. Take that use. multiply at times maybe our own personal history, multiply that times 100, 1,000, 1,000,000, and you can see where all of a sudden the things we need the most of is what we're going to have the least of. Now, the cruel trick that we see in recovery, in fact, we have a name for it. It's called post-acute withdrawal syndrome. And basically, those are normal signs of early recovery, kind of the aftershocks after the earthquake. Okay? First part of the brain that falls asleep is the last part that wakes itself back up. So what I need the most of is what I'm going to have the least of. What I want the least of is what I'm going to have the most of. I always tell folks in group, not that I'm trying to sell anybody anything, but this is an important part of recovery for all of us, however you choose to execute this. It's one of the reasons why it's so important for folks in recovery like myself, go to meetings, go to group, go to church, go to some other, where there's some other input other than just ourselves. If I'm the only frame of reference of how good or bad I'm doing, and I'm in here early on, I can look in the mirror and convince myself I ain't worth keeping on this planet. Or I can also go the other direction and convince myself I'm about ready to walk on water. Either way, if I'm not worthy of keeping myself on this planet, I don't deserve your help. And if I'm ready to walk on water, I certainly don't need your help. We need that balance. Again, if I'm the only frame of reference of how good or bad I'm doing is me, I can put myself in a really bad place really fast. Especially, again, we talk about the first 90 days of sobriety for most people can be the most difficult. Okay? A lot of times when people come out of treatment and they go to meetings, or you first start going to meetings by themselves, and you hear people talk about 90 meetings in 90 days, people think, oh my God, that's like a jail sentence. 90 meetings in 90 days. Well, a lot of us very quickly are reminded that I certainly drank 90 times in 90 days. So maybe I can focus, on 90 things to stay sober in 90 days. But for most people, those first 90 days are the most difficult. And I always warn people and caution them that that doesn't mean day 91's a walk in the park. We still have to work on this. But the first couple of months, what I need the most of is what I'm going to have the least of. When we start talking about initiating actions, following through with promises, every alcoholic, and I know you know somebody like this, every alcoholic, when he or she gets sober, realizes they have 9,000 half-finished projects. Always had so much intent. The garage is full of, going to do this. Now I got a better offer. Can't stay focused on anything. There's an inability to initiate action or make decisions. The reason for that is what our decision maker is reason and judgment. It's one of the reasons why I've had a lot of people over the years talk about interventions seem to be really cruel and heartless, and that sometimes you have to take a situation. If you've got a man or woman, husband, wife, partner, son, daughter, mom, dad, coworker, that you have a concern about, and you're asking them, and they're in this situation, and you're asking them to make a rational decision about whatever it is they need to do to change their lives, you're talking to somebody who's unarmed. It's got nothing to do with intelligence, intellect, schooling. That part of the brain that says this is a problem, that rational thought is not there. It comes back over time, but when we need it the most, sometimes we need somebody to intervene and do the thinking for us and put us where we need to be. And hopefully after a while, when reason and judgment comes back, we realize that we are where we need to be, and that was a great decision they made. So again, that inability to make those decisions or initiate action is not from laziness, which a lot of times the person's accused of. It has everything to do with the part of the brain that would say, you need to take care of this. It's not there. The last one, real quick, and like I said, this will go about 45 minutes. The last one is basically, it's a combination of things. There's total collapse of everything. I had mentioned in the last segment about work, possible job loss, and I said sometimes that occurs, but very often you don't see that occur until here. Work, for some reason, and I have two theories of why. Can't prove it, but I have two ideas of why that happens. Work is the last place it shows up. When it starts to show up at work, either in performance, attendance, whatever it is, quality of work, whatever it might be, when it starts to show up and affect the person's work habits, their personal life, their relationships, their health, their spiritual life, their finances, everything else is pretty much in shambles. Work is the last place. And I mentioned in the last segment, and I'll mention it again, I can't prove this, but I have a funny feeling, at least it was in my case. Work is the last place because society says everybody knows an alcoholic or an addict of whatever kind he or she may be. Everybody knows they don't have jobs. Well, I have a job, so I can't be one. And then it becomes purely economical. No job, no money, no booze. God, I got to hold on to this job. That is the last place it shows up. When we start to get to that point and it's affecting our work and everything else, there really is that collapse of everything. This is where, again, I forgot to mention, when this positive stuff goes offline, positive self-thing, self-respect, self-worth, that gets replaced very quickly by negative self-things, self-pity, self-hatred, self-criticism, self-centeredness, all that negative sense of self. So here we are, we're looking around, everything is gone, everything we swore would never happen. We always talk about acronyms and abbreviations in sobriety, and we've got some great ones like HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. HOW, when somebody says, how do you get sober? It's honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. One of my favorite that most people, recovering or not, know about because it's kind of common jargon now. That's the concept of KISS, keep it simple, stupid. One of my favorite ones is the word yet. When somebody says, well, that never happened and that hadn't happened and I didn't do that, we're always told, tack on the word yet. You're eligible too. Absolutely. So when somebody says that'll never, going back to something I'd mentioned before we started this segment, I can look at this list of signs and symptoms that we've discussed today, and every one of those things happened to me except for two things. I never got arrested, and I always mention, and I don't mean this in a rude way, it wasn't from lack of trying. It just never happened, and I'm not dead yet. And I'm smart enough to know now that all those other things that I swore never would happen, not me, doesn't happen to people like me. I'd mentioned in the first segment, 98% of the addicted population looks just like me. Looks like anybody sitting here. It's not the stereotype of the bum in the gutter and the bag lady. That some of us end up there, but 98% look just like me. I swore none of this stuff would happen, and it all did except those two things. Sober, I'm smart enough to realize that if I never thought those other things were going to happen and they did, if I go back out, there's a pretty good chance those two things are going to happen. That helps me stay focused on, I'm a sober alcoholic, I've been sober a long time, but I still am one. Okay? I know that's bad grammar, but we started this off with is I is or is I ain't. Okay? I is. Okay? There's no doubt in my mind that yes I is. If you're not familiar with that, in case you're wondering where that title came from, it's a line in a great old blues song about is I is or is I ain't, and I think that really applies to our situation as well. So anyway, here we get to that point where we say everything I swore never was going to happen has happened times 10. Everything just collapses. The person caves in, and they adopt this attitude of I don't care. Whatever happens, happens. There's an old saying in AA. There's 3 outcomes of active addiction: incarceration, insanity, or death. And a lot of us get to that point where we're right there on the edge where I don't care. Everything I've tried hasn't worked. I'm trying the best I can and nobody believes me. You already think I'm using anyway. Why bother? Everything just caves in on the person. The sad part about that, there's a fourth outcome of all this, and it's one that everybody hopefully is familiar with because you're practicing it. The fourth outcome is sobriety. We can change it. And we can turn this around. This certainly can be a death sentence if we allow it to be, or we can use it and move on. There's an old, and I'll finish on two little things real quick. There's an old Oriental philosophy. Everything in life is two. It's either a stumbling block or a stepping stone. The event and the situation is the same. How we choose to view it or use it determines whether it caves us in or it makes us stronger. Okay? I always like to end any presentation that I do in a very simple way, and it's a very important way for me. I'd like to thank everybody for being here over the course of this little project here, and most of all, I want to thank everybody for helping me stay sober one more day. So keep up the good works, good seeing everybody, and see you real soon. Enjoy. Thank you. I want to thank you for being here for this last segment, and before we finish, I'd like for you to take advantage now of the assessment tool that we had spoken about.